Oh, hey, there we go.
Calling Chris Anderson. Where are you?
This week I'm back in Newbury. So again, as I said,
Newberry. What country?
oh,
Where?
England. You might
England.
recognize the same pictures from the last
Oh,
time we.
nice. I was
And
thinking that if you're coming back to the same hotel room, you should just start putting a number on the wall, like it just slash. So it looks like how many days has he been in?
yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't mind. It's the Anderson room. And you look like you're actually back in Chicago.
I am in Chicago
That's
again.
crazy.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I'm here for the next, I think, 4 weeks. Yeah,
Yeah.
welcome. Hey, Chris, welcome to you, and welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their historical tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, okay, we're glad you're here. And today we're going to be talking about abolitionist Charles Sumner, a towering figure of the 1850s and 60s, both literally and figuratively. And Chris, we should take a moment to thank our Patreon supporters.
Absolutely. The august support patrons.
Yes, especially our top shelf supporters. And you can become a supporter at any level, including the top shelf level, by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And let us know, guys out there, what you're drinking. And Chris, do we have anybody, or is it have we finally gotten to the week where it's just you and me and we're here by ourselves again?
No, we have people actually hanging in there with us. It's Liz Mumford is joining us, Susan Yu, Janet from Wheaton, Jean Templin, who I just saw the other day in London. So I guess she made it home safely, which is good.
Oh, Ken. Excellent. And we have Jim Stark and Wallace Morrison and David Picker, Ron Griswold, Susan Yu. So lots of familiar names and a few unfamiliar names. So welcome if you're just joining us for the first time. And Chris, are we ready to roll? Are we ready to make this show make broadcasting history here with episode 203?
I think so. Oh, sure. Okay. I pull out the thumbs.
I drank 4 cups of coffee today.
I can tell.
It is totally having an impact.
All right. Here we go. The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, Charles Sumner is a person who's barely remembered today, I think, by a lot of people. But as America careened towards civil war, he was the conscience of the North, a striking abolitionist, a man in many ways ahead of his time. And he is the subject of a new biography by our guest, Stephen Puleo. And it's called The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union. And Stephen Puleo is a historian, teacher, public speaker, former journalist, and the author of several books, including Voyage of Mercury, Dark Tide, about the Boston Molasses
awesome book
crisis, American Treasures, and The Caning. So we want to say, Stephen, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Rick. Thanks for having me. My favorite kind of happy hour, History Happy Hour.
There you go. Exactly.
Did you bring a drink to History Happy Hour?
I did. I brought a polar seltzer, but it does have lemon in it. No booze, but lemon. So,
Chris, are you imbibing?
No, not well. I was imbibing, so now I'm carbonating.
I'm the only one drinking at happy hour.
You had that issue.
Proud to be doing it.
Well, I couldn't bring my Glen Turret with me, so I'm kind of at a loss.
So, Stephen, if Charles Sumner is remembered at all today, it's probably because he was attacked on the Senate floor by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks and badly beaten, which was an event that rocked the country and helped propel us to disunion. And I'm sure we'll get into that and talk about that. But you suggest in the writing of this book that there's a lot more to Charles Sumner worth remembering. And so can you give us the 1 minute or brief summary of why in 2024 we should be interested in Charles Sumner?
Sure. I would say that over the 2 decades, probably the most dramatic, provocative, shocking, tumultuous 2 decades in American history, that is the 1850s and 1860s, which is the run-up to the Civil War itself, and a large part of Reconstruction. Sumner's voice was the loudest, the boldest, the clearest, the most provocative, the most unwavering anti-slavery, equal rights voice in America. And I think he's one of the most influential people in American history because of that. I put him in a very small group of what I call influential non-presidents, along with Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., and Sumner, as people who have had enormous influence over the direction of the country. In Sumner's case, anti-slavery influence, equal rights influence over that 2-decade period. And his ideas, his vision were important 100 years later. And we can get into that a little further, but he was well ahead of his time.
Yeah. So I think, and we're gonna get into all that because, to be honest with you, I think I was pretty well read, and I didn't realize his influence until I read the book. And because obviously I think the caning sort of overshadowed other things, but just to kind of lay some groundwork, tell us a little bit about his background, kind of where he's coming from, and sort of where his story begins, or where his arc begins.
Yeah, so I think in his younger days, Sumner's influenced in a couple of ways. One, his dad, who he doesn't have a very strong relationship with, is very much an anti-slavery person and does have influence on Sumner growing up. But Sumner really gets his initial strong anti-slavery bent when he visits Washington, D.C. as a young man, a 23-year-old fresh out of Harvard Law School, like a rite of passage trip to D.C. where he sees the slave auctions and the slave pens. And then really, I think, gets an education when he goes to Europe, another rite of passage trip in 1838. So a 2-year trip that takes him to England and France and Italy. And during that time, he sees blacks and whites, commingling at things like seminars and lectures and cultural events. And after one of those events in Italy, he writes back home and says, it appears that the differences between whites and blacks are more ones of education and opportunity and are not part of the general nature of things. That's really kind of a key moment in his education. And he gets back in 1840, practices law for a few years, finds it very much unfulfilling, dry, dusty, boring. And in 1844, he and his sister, the only sister he's really close to, he's one of 9, and he's close to one sister, Mary. They become very ill in 1844. They're in the beds next to each other. Mary does pass away. Sumner recovers. They thought he was going to die, and he recovers. And at that point says, I need to do something more with my life, more meaningful. And that begins kind of his entree into the anti-slavery world.
So I just want to add on really quick, Rick, add on to this. One of the other things that really surprised me, and maybe you can touch on this too, is he's a pretty difficult guy to get along with. And for somebody who's going to be kind of looming large in the political scene and be an influencer, he doesn't really have the characteristics that you would think that would lend itself to that. So maybe you could mention a little bit about that before we get into his story.
Of course, yes. Sumner's a very difficult guy to know. He's a very difficult the guy to be with. He's an elitist. He's very condescending. He's imperious. He's almost humorless in many ways. His friends can only take him in small doses. We all have friends like that. Sumner was that person.
Are you guys talking about me again?
Exactly. No, I think we're all that people from time to time. But Sumner was that. He just had a very difficult time with personal relationships. And, you're absolutely right, Chris. It kind of costs him in a way because he's in a profession, he's in a business, politics that requires alliances. And he had a difficult time forming alliances. And in some ways that hurt him. I think through the legislative process and even after the caning or during the caning, when almost nobody comes to his aid. It's because he has very limited friendships. He's, the exception is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who he's friends with most of his life. But yeah, you are absolutely right that you captured that. He's a difficult guy to know.
Yeah. Well, there's to kind of follow up on Chris's thought there, there's a case in 1846 where he doesn't like a vote to support the war in Mexico that's been made by Representative Robert Winthrop. And let's just say that this is before he's in the Senate. It's 10 years before the caning by Preston Brooks. So he attacks, but he doesn't just attack his position. He attacks Winthrop in very vivid, personal language that mirrors a lot of what we see today on the campaign trail. And he's shunned by Boston society, by many of his friends. And what I was struck by reading that is that it kind of foreshadows what's going to happen to him 10 years later when his attacks lead to Preston Brooks attacks. He has his position, which is way ahead of its time, and he's really incapable of toning it down, isn't he?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He, it's the good part and the bad part of Sumner, right? He doesn't compromise on the issue of slavery. He's unbuyable. He's unbribable. Those are all virtues. But on the other side, he does engage in a lot of personal invective throughout his life. You point out the Winthrop's this respected congressman. I'd say he's tepid on the issue of slavery. Sumner's not thrilled about that to begin with. But when Winthrop supports the Mexican War, as you say, Sumner calls it one of the worst acts ever, calls him Judas Iscariot.
And he's a friend. I mean, he's friends with Sumner. He was up until that moment.
Right. And he does get shunned. I mean, there's a great quote in the book where Sumner says, at one point, all of these drawing rooms and living rooms were open to me. Now I get shunned. People wouldn't go to parties if Sumner was going to be there. Or people said, who's on the guest list? Is Sumner going to be there? That's after the Winthrop situation. And you're right, it's in 1847. So he has a tough time throughout his life with that. But there are many times he talks about deliberately engaging in personal invective, particularly in his speeches, because he feels as though that gets the person's attention, and then they would be more apt to pay attention to the issues. So it's by design in many cases. It's not an accident. I mean, Sumner does have trouble relating to people, but these are really conscious decisions that he makes to do that.
So, Stephen, I would like to we'll talk about the caning, but also some of the other things, because there's a lot more to the story. And throughout the book, there are moments where you can see he's clearly out ahead of everybody else. And he's, whether intentionally or not, he's sort of dragging that issue forward. So one of the things that struck me right out is we could start with Roberts versus the city of Boston. This is a legal case that he gets involved in 1848. Again, I knew nothing about. And there's a lot going on there.
I mean, I'll just say this is 120 years before the Boston school busing crisis, right? And all the same issues are being come out in court there.
So let's use that as an example of how he's kind of getting ahead of the curve there.
Yeah, and Chris, you mentioned really the case 1849. This is 2 years before he's elected. Really, the case that gives him kind of a national profile is the Roberts case, Sarah Roberts case. So Sumner is representing 5-year-old Sarah Roberts, a black girl who is forced to pass 4 or 5 white schools up on Beacon Hill before she gets to a colored school that she can attend. Her father sues the Boston School Committee, loses in the lawsuit, and then they appeal the case to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Sumner handles the appeal and makes these remarkable arguments. I say remarkable because they've never been made before in American history. And for the first time ever, the phrase equal justice under the law is used in an American courtroom, and it's used by Sumner. For the first time, the concept of separate but equal being inherently unequal is put forth by Sumner. And if you kind of go forward, Sumner's arguments are amazingly compelling and amazingly ahead of their time, as you say. The equal justice piece finds its way into the 14th Amendment in 1868. But I think even more noteworthy is that 105 years later, in Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, Thurgood Marshall's arguments really mirror Sumner's. Sumner is the bedrock of Thurgood Marshall's Brown arguments where the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is inherently unequal. Words Sumner was uttering in 1849. And then lots of Sumner's ideas find their way into Martin Luther King's speeches, and writings find their way into the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1965. So it gives Sumner this large national profile, even though he loses that appeal. He loses the case. But he puts forth these ideas that really no one had been putting forth. I mean, it's 1849. It's very early in the game for these kinds of ideas.
I just want to also latch onto that. Are these ideas that are coming from him, do you think, or is he just kind of like grabbing a hold of things that people are already talking about and presenting it? Because
I think most of them are his. I mean, he's very well read. He's a very strong believer in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So kind of the underpinning of a lot of his ideas is this: all men are created equal. Is this guarantee in the Constitution of a Republican form of government, small r, Republican form of government. So really, he's basing it on that, I would say, as his bedrock. But this notion that it applies now to blacks, that this notion of not just anti-slavery but equality. He makes this equality argument, which even many abolitionists weren't making.
Right. I mean, that's kind of what really struck me is he is out there with these ideas, which he is dead set on from a long time before he's in the Senate. That black and white are equal, that African Americans should be able to vote. They should be able to, have equal opportunity in the schools, equal opportunity to ride on the trolley cars and stuff. And for a lot of people, this is like, well, wait a minute. We just said they shouldn't be slaves. We didn't want all that stuff. But he is dead set on this.
Yeah. And I think there's different levels. You have some people, so-called moderates in Massachusetts, conservatives in Massachusetts. Some people who say, listen, we don't want slavery to be extended into the territories, but, we really can't do much about it in the southern states. Then you have, as you say, Rick, that group of people who says, yeah, okay, maybe the slaves should be free, but this notion of equality, we're not sure how we feel about that. So, yeah, Sumner keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. I say this in a positive way, even as the great Reconstruction amendments get passed. So when the 13th Amendment gets passed to eliminate slavery, Sumner wants there to be more of an equal rights language in there as well. And basically his colleagues are saying, let's take what we can get right now. So Sumner's always looking to get more on these issues. I think it's one of his great virtues.
A big part of Sumner's political life revolves around the fugitive slave law, which he is deadly opposed to. But it's actually a case involving that law that helps him get elected senator, because it looks like, he's kind of right on the edge of being elected senator. And then you get the case of Thomas Sims. And how does that tell us a little bit about that case, about the fugitive slave law, and how that affects Sumner's political career? Yeah,
very important
case. Sumner's political career.
Very important case on all of those aspects. So Thomas Sims is a runaway slave from Savannah, Georgia. He stows away on a brig that it travels up the eastern seaboard, pulls into Boston. He hides in South Boston for a while, but eventually makes his way downtown and is captured by slave hunters on the streets of Boston. And he is put in jail, and he is sent back to slavery a few days later after a cursory court appearance, which the fugitive slave law calls for. The slave law also calls for free state courts and free state legal machinery to assist slave hunters. One of the reasons Sumner's really appalled by this. What's happening at the exact same time is the Massachusetts legislature is trying to decide on the U.S. senator to replace Daniel Webster. You'll recall senators were not directly elected by the people at this time. That doesn't happen until 1913. So in 1851, the Mass House is kind of torn. They can't come up with a candidate. The leading candidates can't get the votes. Sumner starts to emerge as a dark horse candidate. And after the Sims case, where Bostonians and the abolitionist movement are really appalled that Boston, the birthplace of liberty, sends its first slave back to bondage, Sumner's elected days after the Sims case by one vote. As the U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, and it's no doubt as a direct result of the Sims case. And so when he gets to the Senate in 1852, he delivers his first major speech, and it's a brilliant speech, and it really serves as the underpinning for his whole career philosophically, and this whole notion of freedom and equality. And it's called the Freedom National speech, specifically Freedom National, Slavery Sectional, in which Sumner argues that the underpinnings and the foundings of the United States, both from the Declaration and the Constitution, were of freedom and liberty, and that slavery is a perversion of those goals, and that freedom is the national position. That is, places that are governed by the federal government, Washington, D.C., territories, the waterways, the ports, etc. And that one important piece of that means that certainly the federal government has no business with one state, a slave state, reaching into a free state to bring a slave back to bondage. So he makes this really brilliant argument, again, very early in the game, 1852, that comes on the heels of the Fugitive Slave Law, and moves at the end of that to repeal the Fugitive Slave Law. A vote he loses 47-4. There's only a couple of senators that agree with him, and the Fugitive Slave Law stays in place. But Sumner makes those arguments in 1852 that advance this anti-slavery equal rights cause and really become, I would say, the foundation for his philosophical approach all the way until he dies in 1874.
Now, another one of the things that, again, I found fascinating is he is very definitely stalwart in his beliefs about this, and he's not going to move, and he's opposed to slavery, and he's an abolitionist, and that's important. Yep. But what you say in the book, though, you say Sumner's framing had moved the radical abolitionist movement nearer to the mainstream, we still had a long way to go, and caused those who are ambivalent or agnostic about slavery to take a fresh look at the issue. So, as you explain it in much greater detail in the book, he's taking what is considered sort of a, I don't want to say wacky, but a far out position and bring it center stage. So could you talk a little bit about that and why that's important to this movement?
Absolutely. Great question, Chris. So what he ends up doing, really, he does two things. He turns the Southern argument on its head. The Southern argument always was, because slavery is not specifically prohibited in the Constitution, the framers meant for it to be legal. Sumner's argument was, no, you can't infer slavery, surmise slavery, suppose slavery, engage in conjecture about slavery. It's not affirmatively in the Constitution. Therefore, the framers wanted it eventually to go away. So he turns that argument on its head. But he also says to the abolitionists who said, listen, we need to tear up the Constitution. We need to tear up the Declaration of Independence because those documents don't explicitly prohibit slavery. Sumner makes that same argument and says, no, again, you can't infer it or surmise it. The fact that it's not affirmatively in there means that the founders did not want it in there. The Constitution gives Congress no power to make a king, nor does it give it any power to make a slave. And so he says, if you love America, you must hate slavery. And so what happens, Chris, to your point, is suddenly the abolitionist movement, which had been perceived almost as an anti-American movement, because so many abolitionists called for the destruction of those documents, now becomes a little closer to the mainstream. So he pulls this really radical so-called fringe movement closer to the mainstream, which helps bolster that movement.
There's a quote from William Lloyd Garrison that you use in the book about his early days in the Senate. So he's elected to the Senate in 1851, and he's a free soil candidate, and there are, I think, two fellow free soil candidates in the Senate. And Garrison says, for a long period, you were in an almost hopeless minority, misunderstood, grossly caricatured, in constant peril of your life while discharging the official duties of your position. But from that darkness, what light has sprung? And the thing that surprised me was the degree to which, 10 years, less than 10 years before the beginning of the Civil War, this idea of equality for slaves and kind of striking down the fugitive slave law, striking down slavery, was such a minority position.
Oh yeah, I mean, so think about this: slavery had been managed both North and South, really since the Constitution, but let's say since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So over the previous 3 decades, you had, these uneasy, but these fragile, I would say, but, effective truces between North and South. When I say effective, no war, the Union was together. And so they did this kind of compromise on the slavery issue. And these compromises were engineered mostly by, these great compromise senators that you learned about in high school. Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, they wielded so much power during this time. And the whole issue of slavery was, again, managed. The South had slaves. The North benefited from slaves, its textile industry, from, cheap cotton. Northern financial companies and banks benefited from financing these textile industries. So Sumner comes along in 1852, 51, as you say, but his first speech in 1852. And at that point, there's literally a gentleman's agreement in the Senate, not even to discuss the slavery issue because it's a presidential election year and they felt it would be too controversial. Sumner only gets the floor to deliver his speech when the budget comes up to fund the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. And Sumner says, oh, here's my opportunity to move to strike it. And so he gives that 1852 speech is the first major anti-slavery speech in Congress in American history. It's in 1852. So that kind of makes your point, Rick, that up to that point, there had been this management of the issue and along comes Sumner, and really upsets the apple cart. There's after that speech, the South sees Sumner as the most dangerous Northern senator because he doesn't make backroom deals. He doesn't flinch, from a political, on a political basis for something that he believes strongly principle-wise. And as I said earlier, unbribable. So they kind of realize this is a dangerous voice in the Senate in 1852.
But he doesn't back down from that. And I guess one of the things I think would be helpful too, maybe to get a little bit more on, is when you describe his speeches, he will speak for 4 hours. I mean, it's just incredible. So if for our viewers and listeners, if you were to sit down in Congress and you were to be there when he gave a speech, what is one of his speeches like? I mean, is it how is he able to kind of carry this out, or is he a good speaker? Is it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to that. One, right, kind of a basic general point, is that lengthy speeches were fairly common in the day. So lengthy speeches were the way a lot of these congressmen, senators, even presidents to some extent, but mostly in Congress, got word out to their constituents via newspapers and pamphlets and things of that nature. So there is that piece. So the point being, like today, no matter how good of a speaker you are, you wouldn't speak for 4 hours, right? So, but that was not so unusual. But that said, Sumner was a very good orator, excellent orator, great with language, very powerful as a speaker, wonderful metaphors and imagery and things of that nature. His speeches were events. So particularly after the first one, that 1856 speech, the speech that really causes his caning, the galleries were filled to overflowing. Even the ladies' gallery, one New York Times reporter said, was filled to overflowing, something that almost never happened. Sumner's always dressed up. He's resplendent in clothing. He's a showman. There's no question about it. Knows that all eyes were trained on him on many of his speeches. And because he's so controversial, I think that adds to the drama. So almost every one of his major speeches, it was a dramatic moment in the chamber.
Yeah.
So I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Stephen Puleo, who is the author of The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the fight for a more perfect union. So we have alluded to this caning a few times. Let's get down into it. And you talked about the speech there that led up to it. But give us a little sense of what leads up to the moment where Preston Brooks walks onto the Senate floor and begins wailing on Charles Sumner.
Sure. So you have to go back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, 2 years previous. Stephen Douglas of Illinois puts forth the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically is going to obliterate the Compromise of 1820, which said that every state below the very famous 3630 parallel, slavery would be permitted, and that every state north of it, slavery would be prohibited, except one state, Missouri. And at the time, as part of that compromise, Congress took a large part of Massachusetts and created another free state called Maine to kind of balance that off. Douglas comes along in 1854 and puts forth the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Kansas and Nebraska territories at the time are about to apply for admission as states. Douglas says, how about we just get rid of the Missouri Compromise and we do this thing called popular sovereignty, where we allow the people in Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether they want to be slave states or free states. Why does Douglas do that? He has his eyes on the presidency. He's a Democrat from Illinois, thinks he's going to need Southern Democratic pro-slavery support to get elected, and I think he's right on that. And also, there's lots of talk about a transcontinental railroad at that time. It still doesn't happen for 12 years or so, but the South wanted the eastern terminus of that railroad to be in the slave state of Missouri, St. Louis. Douglas wants the eastern terminus of that railroad to be in his home state of Illinois, Chicago. So he knows he has to do some horse trading with the South. The South loves the idea of popular sovereignty because they can send thousands of people to Kansas. Nebraska, a little too far north for slavery to be economically viable, but they could send thousands of people to Kansas in an attempt to influence the vote. And that's exactly what happens. Abolitionists send thousands of people, and these are from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, to Kansas. And the real fighting takes place in Kansas. The nexus of the slavery debate is not Boston, not South Carolina, not Washington, D.C., but Kansas for all of 1855, most of the first part of 1856. So it's there's murder, there's mayhem, there's destruction, there's rapes. It's really violent on the plains. Sumner receives hundreds of letters from Kansans saying, help us, sir. You know, you're the anti-slavery voice in the Senate. What can you do to help us? Sumner finally decides he's going to give this major speech, which he writes up. It's a 5-hour speech. It's called The Crime Against Kansas. He delivers it for 3 hours on May 19th, 1856, for 2 hours on May 20th, 1856. And, you know, had he just stuck with the issues, it's a brilliant speech. If he had just stuck with the issues, I think history might have been a little bit different. But he doesn't. He does engage again in this personal invective. And this time he trains his oratorical sights on the senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. South Carolina, probably the most ardent pro-slavery state. Butler, one of the most ardent pro-slavery senators. And Butler's not in the chamber. He's home recovering from a stroke. And the stroke left his face partially paralyzed. So Sumner begins personal attacks on Butler during the speech. He says at one point that Butler has a mistress who is polluted and ugly to most of us, but beautiful and chaste in his eyes. I'm talking about the harlot slavery. And then another time he says, every time Butler speaks, again, alluding to his stroke, he had a very difficult time speaking. He expectorates, he spits when he talks. And then Sumner says, every time he opens his mouth, out flies a blunder, which is kind of his double meaning. And so he gives this speech, and at the end of it, the South is absolutely outraged. Most of Sumner's northern colleagues are absolutely outraged. And The person who's probably outraged the most is the congressman from South Carolina, the western part of South Carolina, Edgefield, Preston Brooks. And there he is right there. Good timing. Preston Brooks, not only is from the same state as Andrew Butler, he is also Andrew Butler's second cousin. And so he tries to figure out what he's going to do to avenge Butler's honor. First, he says, should I challenge Sumner to a duel? His colleagues say, no, duels are reserved only for gentlemen. Sumner does not rise to the level of a gentleman. So that wouldn't make sense. Brooks says, should I invite him out and just, we do it as men. We settle it with fisticuffs. No, his colleagues say Sumner will never come outside. He will just tell you to come to his desk, which I suspect was also true. So finally, Brooks makes up his mind, and on the morning of May 22nd, late morning, almost noontime of May 22nd, the Senate is out of session, but there are people milling around the floor. Sumner is up at his desk, head bowed, and he's signing copies of his Crime Against Kansas speech, franking them, as the expression goes, for his constituents to be published all around the country. Brooks comes in with a couple of his colleagues, notices there's a woman in the chamber speaking to the sergeant of arms, and sits down because he says later, I couldn't do what I came to do with a lady present. It just wouldn't be chivalrous at that point. She finally leaves after about 15 minutes. Brooks gets up, walks down the center aisle. Sumner's head still bowed. He's still signing copies of the speech. Brooks walks down with his cane, gets to Sumner and says, Mr. Sumner. Sumner looks up at him. Brooks begins to raise his cane and he says, I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel against my state and my kin. And then, bam, slams the cane down on Sumner's head. Sumner's head explodes in blood. And the bloodlust, I think, really sends Preston Brooks over the edge. He beats Sumner again and again and again. Sumner is got his legs kind of wedged under his desk. The desk is manacled to the floor. He can't really move. Finally, he wrenches the desk from its manacles, topples over. Brooks grabs him by the lapels and keeps beating him. Brooks's cane shatters into pieces. He's finally left just holding the knob of the cane. Brooks says later, I gave him 30 first-rate stripes. And at the end, he was bellowing like a calf. And Sumner, finally, just before he slips into unconsciousness, he's in a pool of his own blood, says, I can't believe such a thing could happen. And Brooks's colleague pulls him away and says, don't kill him, and leads Brooks from the chamber. Sumner is taken to the anteroom next door, and his treatment and his recovery begin. But the caning really goes across the country like a wildfire, and news is everywhere, north and south. Two very distinct responses. The North is outraged. The South, almost universal acclaim for Brooks. This abolitionist had it coming to him. The abolitionists are trying to, change our way of life. It's about time somebody took action. In fact, Brooks has sent hundreds of canes as gifts from Southerners, some of them inscribed with the words, hit him again. Sumner is out of the Senate for about 3.5 years, tries to get close, but really has this PTSD as he gets close. He has brain trauma. He has back issues. He has neck issues, all of that. But the caning serves one very important purpose. Many purposes, but one very important purpose, and that's during the summer and fall of 1856. Thousands and thousands of Northerners join this new anti-slavery Republican Party. And the Republican Party grows and puts up its first presidential candidate in 1856, John C. Fremont, who almost wins, doesn't quite win, but almost wins. And as Sumner's trying to get back to work during the summer and fall of 1856, his colleagues are saying, you know what? Don't rush. Take your time. Make sure you're well, because your vacant chair speaks even more effectively than you.
So yeah, I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but you say that caning, it's a line that gets crossed there for the nation, right? That's for you. That's sort of the, I guess, the final step to civil war, or is it?
Yeah, yes, I do.
Yeah.
I do think it is. I think it's really it's the event, it's the episode that takes the slavery debate from a political debate, sometimes even an academic debate, to this visceral, gut-wrenching, emotional moment. And so it still takes 5 years for war to happen, right? This is May of 1856. Fort Sumter is attacked in April of 1861. So it takes 5 years, but the dominoes start to fall. A lot of these moderates, for example, in the North, they're not big fans of Sumner. They're not even big fans of abolitionists, even as it's moved more into the mainstream. They find themselves politically with nowhere else to go but to support Sumner, and also viewing the South as not just bullies. I mean, he's often called Bully Brooks, but anti-First Amendment people. In other words, yes, they agree Sumner insulted Andrew Butler. No question about that. And not a lot of Northerners were thrilled with that. But if the answer is you get beaten to within an inch of your life for something that you said, then that's an anti-First Amendment thing too. So you really had those dominoes start to topple with the growth of the Republican Party. The Dred Scott decision, I think, that happens in 1857, Southern-leaning court that declares blacks are not citizens and declares that Congress can't prohibit slavery anywhere, I think is a direct reflection of the anger the South felt, as a result of that whole caning episode. Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. Lincoln mentions the caning several times. John Brown's raid in 1859. John Brown, 2 days after the caning, when he's in Kansas, very gruesomely, he and his brothers murder a family of pro-slavery people, which increases the ire of the South, but also turns Brown into almost a legend in a sense. And so I think all of those things start to happen. I think Lincoln's election in many ways is related to his strength across the North, where he wins every northern state, doesn't win a single Southern electoral vote, but wins the presidency. I think his election is largely due to the growth of the Republican Party as a result of the caning. So yeah, I do view it as a line that gets crossed.
I'll bring in a question from one of our viewers. And Tiffany Horn Fannin says, could Sumner be compared to Thomas Paine with regards to personality and vision?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tiffany. I think, to be honest with you, I mean, Paine had his prickly side, but I think Sumner is even more difficult. Like, Sumner would not be a person you'd invite to the history happy hour. And you might invite Paine. You might invite Paine. Sumner, I think, is more dour, just a little bit humorless. And I'm not saying, again, that Paine was a comedian. He was not. But I think their ideas are very similar. I think Tiffany's onto something there. But I feel like Sumner's personality was much more difficult. We'll probably touch on some of his relationship with Lincoln, but
let me, and Chris, if it's okay, let me jump in with that, because that's a question that also Wally Morrison asked about his relationship. He said, did Sumner have an influence on Lincoln's thinking? Sumner's the head of the Foreign Relations Committee during Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln is a guy who famously relies heavily on humor in his relations to other people. Sumner is famously a guy who doesn't have a sense of humor, but they're definitely political allies. So what kind of relationship do they have, and to what degree does Sumner influence Lincoln?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a big part of this book. The book starts off with a prologue where Charles Sumner is at Lincoln's deathbed the night he is shot, and he spends all night there along with several other people, and says that, after the fact, that he sobbed like a woman when he found out Lincoln was gone at 7:20 the next morning on April 15th. They had a very strong relationship. I would say a very intimate relationship, although a very short one. They don't meet until Lincoln comes east for the inauguration in 1861 in March. And of course, 4 years later, Lincoln is assassinated. But I think they each learn from each other. And it's really interesting as it develops. I think Sumner teaches Lincoln a great deal about moral courage, standing up for moral courage, even if it's not sometimes a politically good thing to do. I think example of that, Sumner is on Lincoln very early to decree that the Civil War is not just about preserving the Union, but is about the eradication of slavery. Lincoln does not come to this conclusion until late in 1861. Sumner is on it almost from the beginning, and I think has a real strong influence in Lincoln's evolution, let's call it. It's not a conversion, that's too strong of a word, but it certainly is his evolution. When Lincoln is considering issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Sumner wants him to issue it much earlier in the game, just feels it's an important thing to do symbolically, that he's able to do it from a military commander-in-chief perspective. So he doesn't need congressional approval because he's doing it as the commander-in-chief. And so he's on Lincoln very early to do that. I think Lincoln, on the other hand, teaches Sumner a great deal too. You mentioned humor. Lincoln, very effective, used humor his entire career. My favorite example, though, of where Sumner is so perplexed by it is when they first meet. So they're at the Hotel Willard in Washington, D.C., and Lincoln receives Sumner. He's the president-elect, Lincoln, and he receives Sumner. Sumner walks in, and they're both 6'4". And Lincoln's really surprised to see somebody that big. And so he suggests to Sumner that they stand back to back to see who's taller. Lincoln thinks this is the most hysterical thing ever. And Sumner has no idea what to do with this. He doesn't know what to make of this person. And so he says, well, Mr. President-elect, rather than uniting our backs, let's unite our fronts against slavery. Absolutely has no idea what to do with humor. But as time goes on, I think Lincoln softens him a bit in that area. And then in terms of politics, Lincoln teaches Sumner that sometimes politics does have to be taken into consideration. And the case in point is the Emancipation Proclamation. So he says to Sumner, as Sumner's on him to issue it early, he says, I can't issue it until the Union wins something. We're getting hammered, and we haven't won anything. So, boy, it would be such a hollow gesture. So Lincoln uses the Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, which the North barely wins. They eke out it's almost a draw, but let's say they eke out a very close win. And on September 22nd, 5 days later, Lincoln finally issues the Emancipation Proclamation using Antietam as the win that he needs. But Sumner is also in his ear to say, you're only making this Emancipation Proclamation apply. You're going to free slaves in states that are in rebellion against the United States. What about our 4 border states that allow slavery? Northern border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri are all part of the Union, and they all allow slavery. You should free the slaves there. Lincoln says, I can't do it because I'm afraid if I do it now, they will secede too. He says, I hope I have God on my side in this struggle, but I must have Kentucky. Kentucky, right, has farms, factories, population. It is like the bulwark defender against Illinois and Indiana in the north. And Lincoln says, if we lose Kentucky, we will lose Maryland. If we lose Maryland, we will lose Washington, D.C., and we may lose the whole game. So Sumner gets that after Lincoln kind of walks him through it, because both Sumner and Lincoln know that the Emancipation Proclamation is not worth the paper it's printed on unless the North wins the war. And in September of 1862, absolutely no guarantee of that happening. In fact, it was less likely than not that they would win,
Right. So, Steve, I wanted to sneak in this question too. People who about the war, people who've watched the show a long time know that I'm an expat and I live in Britain now, so I'm always kind of curious about how American history plays out over in England and whatnot. And you raised some really interesting points about what Sumner does in relation to Great Britain and what's happening there during the war. So obviously we know about his work as an abolitionist, but maybe you could just touch on sort of what else he does and why that's important, and maybe also how he's explaining this Civil War and abolition, all this to people in Europe, because Europe is important to him, and he comes over here, right?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. So, I mean, I think the best example is he literally almost single-handedly helps avert war with England a couple of times, right? The first is when the Confederacy is desperately seeking England's backing, right? And they send emissaries to England aboard the USS Trent. Yes, and so an American captain gets word of this and basically captures the Trent without authority from Washington, takes the two emissaries off, Confederate emissaries off, lets the ship go free, and imprisons the two emissaries. Anyway, it's a big, long, I would say, back and forth brouhaha between diplomatic issue between England and the United States. The British are furious because at that point the ship was neutral. They hadn't recognized the South as a belligerent at that point, and so they viewed it as a crime to take these British soldiers off, these British sailors rather, off. And what ended up happening is Sumner, through his contacts in England, is able to quell this demand for war against the United States. Britain was actually does send thousands of troops to Canada, was about to send more for potential invasion to the northern part of the United States. Lincoln feared this two-front war, as he called it, one against the United States and one against the Confederacy. The other point is, at one point, the Confederates, who have no navy, are using British shipyards to build ships. And the USS Alabama is one of those ships, and it wreaks havoc on Union shipping. And a little bit later in the war, Sumner demands recompense from the British for prolonging the war by helping the Confederates, for the British helping the Confederates build these ships. And he ends up getting it. He doesn't get as much as he wants, but the court in Hague awards $15 million to the United States after the war is over because of Britain doing this. So there's that piece. The other piece is Sumner's well aware of this weird dichotomy in Britain where the upper class, and it's kind of like the dirty little secret among the British, the upper class really do have sympathies towards the Confederates. And one of the reasons initially is because there is no proclamation from Lincoln that the war is about the eradication of slavery. But I think the other pieces to that are economic. Number one, the upper class is missing its finery from some of the textile industries in England that also depended upon Southern cotton after the North establishes the blockade. So that's one. And two, the upper class in England, I think, secretly really likes the monarchical kind of hierarchy of the slavery system that's in the South. Conversely, the working and lower class British are huge Union supporters, big Lincoln supporters, love the Union. So you have that whole dichotomy happen in England too. And Sumner tries to manage that as well, saying to some of his ministers of parliament friends, how can you possibly even think of, supporting the Confederacy, which, is in existence to keep slavery alive, when you've done nothing but preach to me on my visits there that slavery ought to be abolished. So he manages all of that on behalf of Lincoln, who has very few overseas contacts. He relies on Sumner's diplomacy to do that.
We're running out of time, but I'm going to throw in as a last question here, a question that comes from one of our viewers, Catherine Beyer-Hurst. And she wants to know, since you had written a book previously about the caning of Sumner, what prompted you to write another book entirely about Sumner? And second question, what Boston figure or happening do you have in mind to address next?
Well, the first question is a great question. And I mean, when I did the caning, I focused almost exclusively on it. But boy, I just knew more had to be done on Sumner. This whole Lincoln relationship, the caning basically stops with the attack on Fort Sumter. I just felt like more had to be done with Sumner, both his relationship with Lincoln during the war, during Reconstruction, all of that. So The Great Abolitionist is the first full biography on him in more than 50 years. And he's just been with me since the caning. I've written 2 books in between that. But I couldn't get Sumner out of my mind, so I needed to do more about him, and that's that point. There will be a Puleo book 9. That's all I'm going to say on the topic. I can't really tell you the topic at this point, but I'm very excited about it, and I think all of your viewers and listeners will really enjoy it.
Well, Stephen Puleo, thank you so much for joining us for what you told us beforehand was your 695th interview since 2003. We trust that it put the other 694 to shame. It was probably
no question
better than Nick. Thank you so much. Any of those. We want to remind people that your book is The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner, and the Fight for a More Perfect Union. Read the book. It's terrific. Really enjoyed it. And so I highly suggest that you guys check it out. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, guys. You were great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good luck with everything.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Chris, next week, I don't have the book cover here. I don't know exactly what happened to it, what's going on. But next week, we are going to talk to Ronald Drabkin, who is the author of Beverly Hills Spy.
Yes.
And this is a story I knew nothing about.
Yep.
It's about a British World War I hero who becomes a fixture in Golden Age Hollywood in the 20s and 30s, and then a spy for the Japanese.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Who is giving them information that helps lead to the Pearl Harbor attack. So I'm reading this. That is literally all I know. And I'm really looking forward to doing this interview next week to discover, well, read the book first and then do the interview to discover the whole story of that. So
just something new about Pearl Harbor. That's got to be.
Yeah. Did you know about this story?
No.
Okay.
It was all news to me.
So it's news to both of us. And so it'll be like virgin territory. It'll be very exciting to see.
There it is.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook. You can shout at us on Twitter. You can listen to our podcast. You can back us on Patreon. And you can browse historyhappyhour.com. All those ways that you can dig into the 200 previous episodes and, immerse yourselves in History Happy Hour.
Thanks, everybody. By the way,
that's like a no reaction. It's like a reaction that you're sublimating.
Yeah, it is. I'm broiling on the inside here. We got a comment from Jean Templin. She'd like to know about giving us a list of upcoming books so she could read them over the summer. So maybe we'll talk to Rick and see about maybe giving people a preview of what may be coming up.
Well, so Rick will talk to Cheryl and we'll see.
Well, yeah, actually, because Cheryl is the one that keeps the wheels on the wagon. So
see if we can make that happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, so anyway, thanks for everybody. Stay safe and see you next week.